Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this lesson we're going to talk all about the QuickMaps section of Trapcode Form. Now we've covered it a little bit in prior lessons, but it's worth covering in detail and having a firm understanding of how to use the QuickMaps. This is especially true with version 2.0 and higher of Trapcode Form because there's been a new function added that allows us to offset the values of these QuickMaps. And we can easily do animations that allow us to animate these parameters over time and over different axes. And we can do these very interesting shape reveals with either OBJs or perhaps even text. So I'll show you all about this section so you can be a master of the QuickMaps of Trapcode Form. So the first thing we'll do is create this reveal of this OBJ here. So let's create a new composition, and I'll call this my shape reveal. I'm working at 960 by 540, which is still 16 by 9, but a little bit smaller so things render quickly. Create a solid for my form OBJ. And I'm going to apply Trapcode Form. Let's also import my OBJ here. I'm going to stick with Bucky 12 OBJ. Let's drop that in there. Turn off the visibility. Go to Form. Set the base form to the OBJ model. And go to the OBJ settings and set the 3D model to that OBJ layer. And I'll create a camera. Tap C a couple times so I can zoom in on this shape. Okay, so the first thing to understand with QuickMaps is that they simply control parameters that have been applied outside of the QuickMap section. So in other words, the QuickMaps are not going to do anything unless we've affected certain parameters like fractal field or disperse and twist, that kind of thing. QuickMaps simply control the intensity over certain axes of these parameters. So if I set the fractal field to affect the displacement of particles, like so, I'm going to turn the f-scale up a little bit because this OBJ is a little bit small. So we'll lower the scale of that fractal field by turning up the f-scale. And I'll also go into disperse and twist and randomize the positions of the particles a little bit as well. To make things more interesting, let's set a color here. And maybe I'll push the size of the particles up to a little bit below 2, maybe 1.5. Now this is evolving over time because our fractal field has a flow evolution of 50. But what we'd like to do is sort of vary this over time. And in fact, I'd like it to start displaced and dispersed like this, but then transition into its shape without any of that fractal field. Now I could animate these properties from their starting value down to 0, and that's one way to do it. A much more interesting way would be to have these parameters reveal over left to right or top to bottom or front to back. And that's exactly what we can do with these QuickMaps. So I'll go to the QuickMaps section, and the first part of the QuickMaps we've already spoken a little bit about. We have opacity and color. Basically, we've got an RGB map that we can apply over an axis like left to right, or in the x-axis, or y, top to bottom. I can vary the opacity and have them fade out. But right now I'm just going to leave them at one color. So if I turn this map opacity and color over to off, it'll just use that blue that I've already set. Let's jump into the other sections here. We have map 1, 2, and 3. So first I'm going to control the fractal strength. So that fractal field that exists everywhere in 3D space and that is affecting our particles, we are going to control how much of that is being applied to the positions of the particles. So I'm going to say, apply this fractal strength map over the x-axis. So the angle that we're looking at right now, that would be left to right. Now we don't see anything changing because we haven't changed our map. By default, the maps are all the way up. Notice we have a value here from low to high, and this map is set so that the entire axis is at its fullest value. Now if I go in here and I start drawing values that go something like this, we can see that we have varying strength over the fractal field. That might not be entirely obvious. Let's go into map number 2 and have this control the dispersed strength over X. And I'll make a much more obvious map here. So I'll have it go all the way down to 0, all the way up, all the way down, back up and down. In fact, let's do this with the fractal strength as well. There, so we have these bits and pieces that have no fractal strength or disperse applied to them, these little strips right here. And those directly correspond to these strips of the map. If I turn this map strength down all the way to 0 for both of these, we'll see that the OBJ is not affected at all. What this map offset does is move this map value all the way up or down. So if we consider this top value to be 100 and the bottom value to be 0, this map offset allows us to move this 100 value all the way up to 200, and this value of 0 gets offset all the way up to 100. So essentially what we've got here is a great way to animate the strengths of these parameters over time and over a certain axis. So as I turn this map offset up from 0, we can see that we are animating the fractal strength across the x-axis. Now I can link these together with expressions, or I can just animate them together. Just to keep things simple, I'll animate them individually, but know that it might be a good idea if they're doing the same thing to animate them using expressions. So I'm going to animate this over the course of 2 seconds. So right here, both of these should be set to 0. That's going to pull the intensity of this entire map all the way down so that nothing is affected by the fractal strength and nothing is affected by disperse. Now I should have 2 keyframes there if I hit U. And let's rewind to the beginning, and I'll turn this all the way up to 200, pushing this entire value of this map all the way up, including the most extreme values over here on the right, which are at 0. These get pushed all the way up an additional 100, because remember it starts at 100 and it moves up another 100. So these values here are getting pushed all the way up to 100. What we're kind of doing is just flooding the values all the way up to their maximum value. So let's turn up the strength of map 2. And we can see it animating over the x-axis. If we'd like it to go the other way, which I was saying left to right, I'm going to go in and flip this map the other way. Now this is a pretty gradual map, and you can notice that the map here is actually fairly gradual. There's another map in here that might work a little bit better for this, which is this one, where it is a little bit more tapered but a lot more sudden. So let's use that one and click flip so that we can flip it the other way. Or we can simply draw our own. So I can draw something like that. That's somewhere in between. Now when we draw, I think it's always a good idea to go in and smooth it out so we don't have any sudden changes or dips that might happen from our unsteady human hand. Now this isn't much of a reveal if we can see it from the very first frame. So what I'm going to do is have the particles scale up from left to right. So I've got one more map that's available to me. So I'll use map 3 and we'll apply this to the particle size and we'll map this over X. But this is going to have to animate a little bit differently. These 2 quick maps here start at 200, their maximum value. So we are applying the maximum value of the quick maps to those parameters. But for the size, and have the value be the opposite of the other 2. So we'll have this go from 0 to 200 using a map like this linear one right here. I could also do this with opacity, but I think particle size is a lot more interesting. Now let's look at another option here that uses quick maps, but also introduces the idea of a layer map to create the shape of the object that we're revealing. In this case, we're going to use some text. Now, I'm using a pre-composed piece of text that has a little bit of color on it, and I want to do that because we can show you how Form can actually use the color and alpha channel of that layer. So let me make my new comp. This is my particles to text, and I'll paste that text layer in here. It's nothing special, it's just a piece of text using the text tool, and I put a 4-color gradient that has some varying color on the surface of the text. In fact, let's close up some of these other compositions here. So let's create my form layer and apply track code form. Now my text layer is a little bit small. If I go inside here, it's 960 wide by 200 pixels tall. We'll have to keep that in mind when we do this. Let me turn that off, go to my base form. Box grid is fine. One set of particles in Z. And I'm going to match the base form size to the layer of that composition, which was 960 by 200. Z doesn't matter because we only have one set of particles in Z. Now, generally, when you're creating an image from particles, you're going to want to match one particle to each pixel. So basically, that's setting the particles in X and Y to match the base form size. So now I have one particle for each pixel of the composition that I'd like to recreate with particles. Now, as I said before, QuickMaps are contained entirely within the plugin. So if I'd like to look at another layer and use its color and alpha channel, I'm going to have to jump into my layer map. So this is just a quick introduction to layer maps, and we'll get much more in depth with these in the next lesson. So in the first part here of my layer maps, I have color and alpha, and I can select a layer to use to drive the color and alpha channel of my particles if I so choose. So we'll map this two-dimensional image over two axes in form. So I'll use X and Y so we can go up and down. Now if I turn on my transparency grid, we can see that it is not taking the alpha channel of that text. And that is because it is using the RGB values and not the RGB plus the alpha channel. So I'll set this to RGBA. And now we see we have the transparency included with the text. Now, just like QuickMaps, layer maps act as a control for the parameters that you've adjusted elsewhere. Layer maps will have no effect if we haven't changed anything else elsewhere in the plugin, like fractal field or disperse. So I'll do the same thing that I did before with the shape reveal. I'll use fractal field to displace it. Maybe we'll set this to 250. And I'll turn up that F scale a little bit to make that fractal field smaller. We'll also go to disperse and twist and add some disperse to randomize the positions of the particles. Okay, so we'll go to map 1. We'll set this to fractal strength over the x-axis, and I'll set this to a linear map to control it from left to right. More on the left side and less on the right side. I'll animate this from 0 to 2 seconds, so this is going to end at 0. So this map offset value is going to end at 0, essentially pulling all of these values down to a 0 value. We'll set a keyframe there and go back to frame 0 and turn this all the way up, essentially flooding all these values to their maximum value. We'll link map 2 to map 1 so that they do the exact same thing, and I'll set this to control disperse strength over the x-axis, and we'll use the same map. So now it's forming the logo, and we just need to control the visibility of the particles. So I'll use size. So in map 3, we'll use the linear map. I'll flip it the other way, and I'll just set keyframes. And don't forget to set the axis here. And we'll set this to 0. So the particles are essentially going to be invisible. And I'll keyframe this, even though we could do it with expressions. And I'll turn this up. And the size will gradually go from left to right, from a size of 0 to their normal size, which is 1. Now, when we're forming something like this, I think it's good to go into our flow and actually have it sort of flow in the direction that the animation is moving. So I'm going to set the flow so it's moving in a negative direction. There we go. So that's the power of QuickMaps. We can animate things in different axes. I can even set this to go along the y-axis if we would like. Have this animate top to bottom. I should probably go and set my flow to, instead of move along the x, to move along the y. Or perhaps a positive value. So this is a feature unique to Form 2.0 and higher. And I think it's, although a very simple control, a very, very useful control. Prior to this map offset control, everything had to be done using layer maps, creating the layers that were animated and pre-comped so that the plugin could see them, and you had to jump back and forth between your compositions, adjusting the layer map composition and your main composition, really only to do basic gradient values like the ones we're mapping right here. Now, in demonstrating this technique to you, I kind of skipped over one little quirk, and you might have noticed it, and it's time to address it now, and that is the semi-transparency of the image. If we take a look at the alpha channel, we can see that the alpha channel is actually a little bit gray. It's not entirely white. In fact, if you want to measure it, you can bring up your info palette and hover over the alpha channel area, and you can see that at 8-bit, which would be 255, it's actually quite a bit below that. Now, why is this happening? We did make our image from 1 pixel to 1 particle, but the problem is we didn't actually use a pixel-shaped particle. It's actually a round sphere that has feathering on it. Now, one obvious solution would be to use a pixel-shaped particle. We could create a new solid and use that as a particle. But I don't consider that a good solution to this because custom particles do render a lot slower than the procedural or built-in particles. Now, if we didn't have any other solutions, I'd certainly show that to you, but there are much simpler ways around this. Now, one super quick way to fix this is simply to go to color correction, levels, and apply that to your form layer. If we go to channel alpha, we can see our white area right here, or what should be white, and we can readjust that white point by going up here and adjusting our alpha input white. And now if we hover over this and measure our alpha, we can see that we've got an alpha of 255. Something else that helps with this is to go into your particle section and take that sphere feathering all the way down to 0. You could also push the size up just a little bit. I'm holding down Alt or Option to push the particles up or down in size by increments of 0.1. But as you can see, because we have more particles overlapping, the colors are getting hotter because we are using a blending mode of Add. If you're using normal, this would actually be a pretty good solution. But I'm going to stick with Add, and I'm going to say that this is probably not the best solution for us. But when we're using levels, the only thing that we're affecting is the alpha channel, and I think that will work just fine for us. So that about wraps it up for QuickMaps. As you can see, they're a very powerful tool inside Trapcode Form. Next up, we'll talk about the layer maps, which jumps outside of the plugin itself but opens up a whole new set of possibilities. So I'll see you in the next lesson.